Okay, gang, it's me again. It's Patrick Cody. I'm here to talk to you about some more delicious EKG topics. Today we're going to move on to our next lesson, during which time we'll cover junctional rhythms, and I'll talk to you about what all that means here in a minute. But before we dive into the junction, I want to just do a brief review of some of our fundamentals, because as I've said before, fundamentals are fun. Right? So today we are going to have tons of fun together, discussing some basics of ECG, some review of what we've done so far, and moving on to some new information. So let's start with just some basic fundamentals, things that we always need to keep in mind. And we'll do this very quickly because a lot of this, hopefully all of this, is review now. So remember, when we talk about automaticity, that refers to the heart's ability to produce its own electrical signal, aka become a pacemaker. And remember that different parts of the heart have intrinsic rates, and this is very important to remember when we're figuring out certain dysrhythmias and so forth. So remember, the atrial rate, I want you just to commit this to memory, is 60 to 100. Okay, the junctional rate, we're going to talk about the junction today. The junction is 40 to 60, and the ventricular rate is 20 to 40. Okay, so just keep these in mind, commit them to memory. It should be just rolling off of your tongue if somebody asks you about these intrinsic rates. Okay, so along with that, let's talk about a couple of other things. Remember, conductivity is the heart's ability to move electrical current from one spot to another. Depolarization refers to the movement of sodium into the cell and potassium out. So if this is the cell here, sodium goes in and potassium comes out, and then they trade each other as the cell repolarizes. So as the cell repolarizes, potassium is moving back into the cell, and sodium, which is an extracellular cation, is moving outside of the cell. Okay, so as we'll see later on in our topics, if you have a dyscrasia related to the potassium, it will impact repolarization. Speaking of repolarization, when we talk about repolarization, of course, we're talking about things that go on here with the T wave. And typically we'll take this T wave and we'll kind of break it in half, and we'll say over here on this half of the T wave we have the relative refractory period, and then over here we have the absolute refractory period. And so the absolute refractory period essentially means that I can throw all the electrical current I want on there, but we're not repolarized enough to then depolarize. But during this relative refractory period, I am repolarized enough that I can go ahead and conduct the next beat, even if I'm not completely repolarized back to my absolute action potential. So as long as we're going to be talking about a little bit of that, then why don't we just review these wave parts real quick. So here we have our P wave, which we've already talked about is atrial depolarization. Okay, QRS, start here, ends here. The QRS complex is ventricular depolarization, and when the atria repolarizes, it does so in here somewhere, so we don't really see it on the paper. Okay, here we have the T wave, which we just talked about, which represents ventricular repolarization, and then our important intervals, the PR interval, start at the P to the beginning of the QRS, which we want to be less than 200 milliseconds, our QRS complex, which we want to be less than 120 milliseconds, and then the start of the Q to the end of the T is called the QT interval, and we want that generally to be less than 500 milliseconds. The last thing I want you to remember about waveforms is remember that these lines here, which are right here and here and here, I'm going to circle these to make them easier to see, and here, these are called the isoelectric lines, and they represent electrical neutrality. Okay, so this is baseline, and baseline becomes very important later on, so make sure that you're able to identify baseline. Okay, that's also the isoelectric line. And then also remember that anything moving upwards means that the electricity is moving in a positive direction towards the electrode, and then anything moving downwards means we're moving away from the electrode. So upwards is towards and downward is away. Okay, so while we continue our review, let's look at this paper real quick. Paper obviously being very important to us, and so we know that the paper is what, 25 millimeters per second, right? So that means it's 5 big boxes per second. Okay, so that means it's 30 big box per second. And why is that important? Why am I telling you that? For a few reasons. Because when we're calculating average rate, the easiest thing to do is to look at a 6-second strip and then count the number of QRS complexes or cardiac cycles and multiply that by 10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 3 seconds. Okay, you see what I'm doing here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Measuring out 6 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 6 seconds. And so if I take the number of QRS complexes which are in here, and then I multiply that by 10, that gives me the average rate across the strip. Okay, it should also be noted then, within every big box, okay, in every big box, since we know the speed of the paper is 25 millimeters per second, we know that one big box is 200 milliseconds, because it takes 5 of them to make a second, right? So 5 times 200 is going to be our second. So within every big box, then we have 5 additional little boxes. So 200 milliseconds divided by 5, then of course equals 40 milliseconds, or 0.04 second. Okay, so we can use that to our advantage later when we're measuring QRS complexes. We're measuring intervals of any kind, quite frankly. Okay, so let's take a minute now and just go back to our primary survey of the rhythm strip. And we've talked about this before, but it bears repeating because, again, it's a solid fundamental for us to know, and really helps us start to compartmentalize pieces of the EKG so that we can make heads or tails of what's going on. Okay, so remember, as we're talking about our primary survey, first thing I want to know is rate. Is the rate too fast? Is it too slow? Is it just about right? Remember that when we're talking about things that kill people, the rate is oftentimes what's going to get us in trouble. Okay, so rate falls into 3 categories, right? It's either too fast, which we call tachycardia, it's about right, or it's too slow, which we call bradycardia. Okay, so fast, as is everything in medicine, if it's fast, it's tachy. If it's slow, it's brady. And if it's about right, it's, well, normal. Okay, there's no medical word for vanilla, so we say normal. Okay, so first thing in our primary survey then is look at the rate. Okay, and then I want to know the regularity. Is this thing regular? Is it regularly regular? Is it irregularly regular? Okay, that becomes important, especially if we're looking at rhythms such as atrial fibrillation like we reviewed in the last lesson. Okay, so is this thing regular? And then let's ask our P wave questions. Is there a P wave before every QRS? Is there a QRS after every P wave? And then, depending on those answers, it will lead us down a pathway to certain rhythms. And we haven't covered all those rhythms yet, so at this point I just want you to ask yourself the question, is there a P before every Q, a QRS after every P? And then I want to know a couple other things. I want to know, what's the size of the QRS? Is it narrow is it wide? And I want to know about my P waves. Are they there? Are they discernible? And what does my PR interval look like? Okay, so I want us to get in the habit of asking ourselves these questions every time we look at a rhythm. Okay, so remember, rate kills. So that's the very first thing I want you to look at, and then I want you to work your way down through all of these, because unfortunately what happens is once you find the first abnormality, you tend to pause and not look for others. So all that to say, you can have a normal rate and an abnormal rhythm, or an abnormal rate and an abnormal rhythm, any number of things. And so I want to make sure that we don't miss those as we're looking at the ECG. Okay, but remember, look at the rate first, because the rate's going to be very important in the care of your patient. And one of the things that's important clinically is for you to correlate the rate that you see on the monitor with what's actually happening to the patient. So check their pulse, because as we've learned, not everything that appears to be conduction on the paper is causing mechanical capture within the patient's myocardium. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to very briefly touch on the rhythms from last week, and by briefly I mean I'm basically just going to identify them and maybe point out one or two salient features. So if you need to, now would be a good time to pause, go back to the last week's lesson, and make sure you have an understanding of these before we move on, because remember, as I've told you over and over again, this all builds upon itself. So here from last week we see the premature atrial contraction, where we have a sinus rhythm, but then we come along here and we see these atrial beats, and we can tell that they're from the atrium, because not only do they have a P wave, but these P waves also look the same amongst themselves, so we know they're coming from the same focus, as opposed to these through here, which are all the same themselves. So they are different than this and different than this, and this comes early, so that means it's premature, but because it's got a P wave, we know it's atrial. Remember, here we have atrial fibrillation, and this is the one where we really don't have easily identified P waves. I would call these non-discernible, and they just basically look like you've scribbled along here. The other hallmark of atrial fibrillation, like we talked about before, was the fact that they are irregular. Okay, multifocal atrial tachycardia. This is a cousin to atrial fibrillation. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish the difference, but the key here is, instead of having a bunch of undiscernible P waves, is you still have a few discernible ones across the way, but you have multiple different morphology. But again, I don't think anybody would fault you for confusing these two and essentially treating them the same. Wandering atrial pacemaker, again, just like these other things we saw, P wave morphology is a little bit different here. We notice some irregularity in this rhythm as well, but the thing that really sets it off for us is the fact that the P waves have slightly different morphology as we work our way through there. Sinus tachycardia. This is a bit of an extreme example with regards to the rate. This is actually probably a pediatric example, but the thing about sinus tachycardia is that you still meet all of the other criteria for a sinus rhythm. So you have P waves, you have narrow QRS complexes, you have appropriate PR intervals, and a T wave as well, so a P before every Q, QRS after every P, and all the other things that you would normally have. Remember, this atrial flutter looks like a sawtooth. Okay, so you've got a hacksaw there, and you're cutting some wood, and you're doing that with atrial flutter. And atrial flutter, remember, can have a variable block. This one happens to be all the same, but you can have some variation with regards to how many flutter waves you have before every QRS complex. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of today's lesson, which is the junction. And so, by way of graphic design, because we know how much I love to draw and I know how much you love to see me draw, the junction refers to the part of the heart that is right here at the junction of the atria and the ventricles. So some people call this the AV junction, or the AV node would probably be the most accurate, but when we talk about rhythms involving the junction, we talk about the AV junction, and we call them junctional. So one of the things that's unique about junctional rhythms is that they kind of have some characteristics of the atrial rhythms, but they also kind of have some characteristics of the ventricular rhythms. And so they're kind of stuck somewhere in the middle, which makes sense since they're called junctional, right? So in this case, here's what I want you to think about. If I have automaticity that originates right here at the junction, then typically what I'm going to see is I'm still going to see a narrow complex like I would if I had something coming out of the atria. But in this particular setting, because I'm actually conducting in a retrograde manner through the atria, I'm going to see one of a couple of things with my P waves. I'm either going to see an inverted P wave, such as this, or I may even see a retrograde P wave, where instead of having the P wave in the normal location, I may see the P wave here coming on my T wave. And I'll show you some examples of that. So the other thing that I may sometimes see is I may actually not see a P wave at all. And what I want you to keep in mind then is when you're thinking about causes of a narrow complex rhythm, definitely the junction needs to be in your differential diagnosis. Okay, and so the junction, again, this part right here, so junction, and remember its characteristics. It's going to be largely a narrow QRS. It's going to be either an inverted P, a retrograde P, which means we see it after the QRS, or no P. Okay, but the thing you can always kind of count on is this narrow QRS. So if you see a narrow QRS complex pop up without a P wave, then that's how we're going to differentiate this from being atrial versus junctional. So for example, I showed you up here the premature atrial contraction, right? And let me erase this to make it a little bit easier to see. So as we're looking at this, we obviously see this premature beat here and this premature beat here, and we know it's atrial because it's got a P wave attached to it. And it's a P wave that's different than our baseline P wave, which is here and here and here and here. So that's our clue that it's atrial. So let's say you had this same thing, but instead of seeing a P wave, you didn't see one at all. Then that would be junctional. Okay, so as we move our way up here, here's another example of a junctional premature contraction. So a PJC, premature junctional contraction. And so here as we look through this, you notice that we have what would normally look like kind of a sinus rhythm, right? Sinus, sinus, something weird here, sinus, 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 something weird here, sinus, sinus, sinus. So this meets all the criteria for a sinus rhythm, right? We have a normal rate, excluding the ones I underlined. We have a normal rhythm, but then we have this irregularity caused by some premature beats, and then we have the P before every one of our normal QRSs and a QRS after every one of our Ps. So the underlying rhythm here is in fact sinus, but then we have these premature beats here and here, and we've got to figure out what to do with those. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and then what you actually have on these is, you'll notice right here you have inverted P waves that look nothing like our native P waves. So again, this is narrow, right? So it's narrow, and if it's narrow, we know it's coming from the atria or the junction, and then we have an inverted P wave. So the inverted P wave kind of tells us the tell that this is going to be junctional as opposed to atrial. So this is a premature junctional contraction as opposed to what we saw before, which was a premature premature atrial contraction. So just by way of comparison, so as I go back up here, here's your premature atrial contraction, upright P waves. It looks pretty similar to what we see coming out of the atria in general, and then as we work our way down here back to the PJC, now we have an inverted P wave. Okay, so that's what's going to, in this case, differentiate this from an atrial premature contraction, or a PAC. So as we move over to this way, and this one is kind of unusual, so let's kind of apply our rules to this. So what do we think the rate is here? The rate here looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the rate is 60. We're okay with that rate. And what else do we see? We see a P wave before every QRS, but the P waves here are inverted, aren't they? They're facing down. Okay, so that's going to be problematic. It's not going to fit into our normal sinus rhythm criteria. But I just told you a minute ago that junctional beats often have inverted P waves. So I'm just going to put in parentheses with a question mark. Could this be junctional? So let's just take a look at the rest of it before we make up our minds. So we do have a P before every QRS, and we do have a QRS after every P, and then the rate is otherwise regular, right? The distance between our R to R complexes is the same. So this is a regular rate, a regular rhythm. There's a P before every QRS, there's a QRS after every P. And then what about our other things that we like to look at? I'm going to erase some of this to make it easier to see. So let's go back now and let's look at our PR interval. And our PR interval is certainly less than 200 milliseconds, and I know that because if I take this one, which starts on a box, then the start of the QRS is within the next box. So I know that our our PR interval, is less than 200 milliseconds. So my PRI is okay. And then my QRS complexes, they're a little on the wide side, but they're not wide enough. Okay, so the distance from here to here is probably 2 boxes, which gives you 0.08 seconds or 80 milliseconds, right? So that's narrow criteria. So this looks like it's sinus with the exception of these inverted P waves, and so certainly then the inverted P waves gives us junctional criteria. Okay, so this is a junctional escape rhythm, and the reason I'm saying it's escape is because you don't get a junctional rhythm until everything in the atrium has decided it's not working. Okay, and so I'm going to call this one junctional escape because it's in that intrinsic rate of the junction. Remember, the intrinsic rate for the junction is 40 to 60, right? So as long as it's in that intrinsic rate, we'll call it junctional escape. And then if it's anything above 60, so if it's 60 to 100, we'll call it accelerated junctional. So this is right on the border, but I'm going to go ahead and give it the benefit of the doubt and call it junctional escape. So if it's 60 to 100, really, let's say 61 to 100, it's accelerated, and then greater than 100 is a junctional tachycardia. Okay, so here's junctional escape. So again, P before every QRS, QRS after every P. We like the rate, we like the regularity. The only thing we don't like is the inverted P wave. Okay, so let's see what kind of surprise we have in store here. So another 6-second strip, so let's start out the way we always do, and let's count. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So at this particular point, our rate is 80. Okay, and I'm okay with that rate, remember, because when I'm doing my primary survey of EKG, rates are either too fast, too slow, or just about right. So our rate here is 80, so let's continue on with our survey here. Next question we want to know, is there a P wave before every QRS? Well, I know that a P wave is usually going to be here, or here, or here, and gosh folks, I just don't see any P waves. Okay, so P waves, we'll put in parentheses because it's absent. And then because of that, we can't answer the question about is there a QRS after every P. I do certainly like the regularity here. There doesn't seem to be any beat to beat variability, so we at least like the rate and the regularity. Okay, so I can't find my P waves. That means I can't find my PRI either. So we'll put that in parentheses. But let's look at these QRS complexes. So are they narrow or are they wide? Let's even zoom in a little bit. So at best they're two small boxes or 80 milliseconds. So they are narrow. So here we have a narrow complex. Okay, we have a regular rate and rhythm with narrow complex QRSs, but no P waves and no PRI. So remember a minute ago I told you up here that with regards to the junction, you typically have a narrow QRS, but sometimes you don't have any P waves because they're getting buried within that QRS complex. So this is an example of that. Okay, so here's a junctional rhythm with no P waves, but otherwise meets some criteria that we like for a relatively regular rhythm. And remember I told you that if it's above the intrinsic rate but below 100, we're going to call it accelerated. So this is an example of an accelerated junctional rhythm. Alright, so let's carry on and look at this next rhythm, and let's follow our same processes for looking at these. So this is a 6-second strip, so let me count up my QRS complexes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So 12 times 10 is 120. Okay, so obviously that's fast, but that's okay right now. It's not terribly fast. And then I'm going to look at my regularity, my beat-to-beat derivation. So here we go. 1. Look, it's all the same, right? These are all the same. Next and next and next. So we like this as regular. Okay, so now the next question we're going to come up with is there a P wave before every QRS complex? Well, I think by now you can tell the answer is frankly no. There is no P wave after the QRS complex, right? Because before the QRS complex, because that would be right here if that were the case. But this is one of those examples I warned you about where the P wave comes retrograde, so it comes behind the QRS complex. So what we actually have here is P wave, P wave, P wave, P wave, P wave, and it comes right before the T wave, as I tried to show you in my beautiful drawing earlier. So this is a retrograde P wave. So in this situation, we actually have a P wave after QRS. So our normal rule of is there a P before every QRS and a QRS after every P, it gets flipped. So now we have a QRS before every P wave and a P wave after every QRS. And that's another hallmark that we may see with junctional rhythms. Okay, so in this case the P is after the QRS, but it's very consistent. And so we can guess that this is a junctional rhythm, and then we can furthermore look at this and check out our QRS width, and it's probably 60 milliseconds at best. So we would refer to that as a narrow QRS. Okay, so narrow QRS. And so at this point we've decided this is junctional because it's got a narrow QRS, but the rate is fast. So remember I told you before, if you have a junctional rate, right, here's your choices. You can have escape, which means it's the intrinsic rate 40 to 60. You can have accelerated, which means it's 61 to 100. And then you can have tachy, which is greater than 100. So this is going to be tachy. So this is going to be junctional tachycardia. Okay, so junctional tachycardia. Alright, so the last thing we're going to talk about in this lesson is one of my favorite rhythms, which is called SVT. And this one's a little different than some of the other things we've looked at, but also at the same time has some similarities that bear discussion. So SVT is sort of a unique animal, and people spend a lot of time getting into semantics about it when they really shouldn't, because EKG, like anything else, you can make exceptionally difficult. But let's talk about SVT and what it means and what it is and what it isn't. So SVT literally means supraventricular tachycardia. Okay, so supraventricular means that it originates above the ventricles. So if I'm looking here at my heart and these are the ventricles here, all SVT means is that this rhythm is originating somewhere above the ventricles. Okay, so already in the last couple of lessons you've learned a ton of things that actually originate above the ventricles. So we're talking about anything from the sinus is above the ventricles, anything in the atria is above the ventricles, anything at the junction is above the ventricles. So SVT in my mind is sort of a garbage can terminology for something that originates above the ventricles. But what we use SVT to represent is we use SVT to represent a rhythm that is fast and narrow and is devoid of P waves. Okay, so you could make the argument that this comes from the junction, or you could make the argument that it's just so fast that it's atrial in nature and we just can't see the P waves. Okay, so if you look at this rhythm strip here, one of the things you'll notice right away is that this is super fast. Quite honestly, this might be a little faster than the standard SVT, but we tend to think of SVT as a rate somewhere around 150. But one of the things you'll see is this is nice and regular, so our R-to-R complexes, R-to-R interval is very consistent all the way through. And so that's a key to SVT, is that it has consistent R-to-Rs all the way through. Okay, there may be just a little bit of variation, but it's tiny, it's minute. Okay, so in SVT, we march along, we're fast, we're narrow, and we usually have P waves that are not discernible. So oftentimes when we're dealing with SVT, actually what we're dealing with is kind of a runaway track, kind of a short circuit, if you will. So imagine if you're going along normally from the sinus and you've got electricity, of course, going into the atria, coming down here in the normal manner. Well, then what if you had a short circuit track that came along this way and then created a re-entry loop? Okay, so a lot of these rhythms actually turn out to be AV nodal re-entry loops because they get a short circuit here going through the AV node. And so subsequently the medicine we give to treat this is a medicine called adenosine, which is an AV nodal blocker. So it works right here at the AV node to disrupt the short circuit and help things reset. So we actually very briefly cause cardiac standstill to allow the short circuit to dissolve. Okay, so SVT, you'll see this quite a bit in the wild. It's nothing to freak out about, it's nothing to panic, but it is important that you know how to differentiate SVT from other fast narrow rhythms. And so the biggest thing that you're going to confuse SVT with is actually atrial fib with RVR. So AFib with RVR, or sometimes a flutter with a 2-to-1 block. If you've got a atrial rate of 300, you'll have a ventricular rate of 150. Similarly, AFib with RVR can be so fast that you won't even see the scribbles of the P waves. And so in that situation, it can be difficult to differentiate these fast atrial fib and flutter from SVT. Well, the good news is, they're all technically SVT when they get that fast. And if you really can't tell the difference, probably most of the time, it's not going to hurt anything to give an adenosine trial. Because think about this, if I go back to this picture over here, if I've got SVT, we see what happens if I give an AV nodal blocker. But let's say instead of having SVT, I've got atrial flutter, right? And so if I do this and I've got flutter waves coming out of my atria, and they're conducting down here through here at a 2-to-1 block, so my atrial rate is 300 and my ventricular rate is 150. If I put a block right here for a couple seconds, which adenosine would do, then I would basically erase the depolarization going into the ventricles, so it would look like I essentially took the ventricles away and just kept the atria, and I would only see atrial beats. And the same is true with atrial fibrillation. I would just see P waves, and that might help me diagnose the fact that I'm dealing with atrial fib and flutter versus SVT, because obviously adenosine is not going to fix atrial fib or atrial flutter. It's just going to slow your ventricular rate down. So one of the things that I would recommend you do at this point, since we're finishing up this conversation about junctional rhythms, is take a minute to kind of review some of these other rhythms, but go to the internet and see if you can find some examples of very fast AFib with RVR and compare those to examples of SVT, so you can practice differentiating the two and understanding the reason they are treated differently. So that's all for today's lesson, gang. Next time we'll move on to something more interesting or less interesting, depending on what you think. But I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson, and as always, if you have any questions, reach out to me.